Hi, everybody. Welcome to Penn Population Studies Colloquium series. Thank you for joining us today. We are excited to be able to continue this long-standing colloquium tradition of engaging in population science from experts across the world. Before I introduce the speaker, I would like to remind you all that this colloquium talk and the Q&A will be recorded for the purpose of disseminating it on the PSC YouTube channel. As you might have noticed, your video and audio is turned off, and this is intentional, so don't be alarmed. Please use the Q&A tool to submit your questions during the talk or after the talk as well. And at the end of the talk, I will call on people to ask their question using their own voice, if you would like. If you do not wish to be called to unmute your microphone and ask your question using your own voice, you can submit your question anonymously and I will read it for you. So thank you again for being here. Now I will move to introduce our speaker for today. Michelle Budig is the Vice Provost for Faculty Development and Professor of Sociology at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Her research interests include labor market inequalities, wage penalty for paid and unpaid caregiving, work and family policy, and non-standard employment. She is currently collaborating on a grant from the United States-Israel Binational Science Foundation to investigate variation in the wage penalty for motherhood among Israeli women. Her research has appeared in the American Sociological Review, Social Forces, Social Problems, Journal of Marriage and Family, and numerous other professional journals. She has also provided expert testimony on the gender pay gap and the motherhood wage penalty to the US Congressional Joint Economic Commission and to the Massachusetts State Legislature, following our theme on public sociology as well in our department. So join me, welcome Michelle. Very excited that you're joining us today. Thank you.
Thanks so much. I'm really happy to be here with you all today. I wish I was there in person. I was at the University of Pennsylvania from 1999 to 2001 and remember it really fondly. And I was really happy when ASAs were there recently because it was so great to be back in Philadelphia. So in any case, I'm glad to be with you virtually and thanks for inviting me in. My project today is a joint project with collaborators in Israel. I've been working with Vered Kraus and Asaf Lebanon, who are both at the University of Haifa. And I'm going to start this talk today by saying I am not the Israeli expert, thank goodness they are, but I'm definitely a student of the Israeli context. And so I'm happy to share with you what I've learned as well as the analyses that we have been conducting with Israeli data. So the title of my talk today is Maternal Employment and Labor Market Outcomes among Religious Groups in Israel. And I just realized I need to share my screen. So there we go. I hope you can all see that. Okay, so I will move forward. So as probably a lot of you know, I've been doing research on the motherhood wage penalty for a really long time, at least 20 years now. And the motherhood wage penalty is the wage gap that's associated with each additional child a woman has, comparing women with more children against women with fewer. So it's a per child effect on wages. And the part of it that we call the penalty is what remains after we account for differences among women with varying numbers of kids in terms of demographic characteristics, their human capital accumulation, and labor market and job characteristics. The motherhood penalty is pretty well established in the literature at this point, and particularly among Western nations. It varies across sectors of the economy, across occupations. It tends to be steeper for less educated women, And there's been quite a lot of disaggregation of the motherhood penalty in the literature. It varies across countries, and it appears responsive to public policies. In a different body of work I've done with my collaborators, Joya Mishra and Irene Bookman, we've studied the motherhood penalty across westernized countries and found that it is associated with the length of maternity and parental care leave, and it's also associated with the availability of publicly funded childcare. Where childcare is higher, the motherhood penalty tends to be lower. In the US, the penalty tends to be larger for white married women relative to underrepresented minority women. I'm going through this fast because I think a lot of us are familiar with this background, but please do shoot me any questions if you want more clarification. But the mechanisms that have been found to produce the wage disparities between women associated with children and help us narrow down what is the penalty. One of these processes is selection. So women with poorer labor market characteristics that predict lower wages anyway tend to become mothers earlier and have more children. Another mechanism is lost experience and seniority. So at least in the US, mothers, particularly less educated mothers, tend to interrupt work and their experience accumulation when they have children. They take breaks from work or they go to part-time work for a period of time. That's less true of more professional managerial occupations, women in those occupations, but lost experience and lost job seniority account for about a quarter to a third of the baseline disparities associated with children on wages. Marital status and household specialization also matter for the motherhood penalty. Married women tend to have a steeper penalty and previously married women, whereas single women tend to have a lower penalty, in part because they interrupt their careers less when they become mothers. Household specialization also matters when partners, largely husbands, work really long hours and mothers work regular hours or part-time. The motherhood penalty is steeper than when they are both working full-time. Job characteristics, there's an argument that mothers trade job characteristics that are family-friendly for lower wages in order to be able to combine work and family responsibilities. In several studies where we've thrown just about every job characteristic that could be thought of as family-friendly in the model, we've not been able to explain any of the motherhood penalty except when we include the characteristic of working part-time. So we haven't found much evidence of that compensating differentials argument. And another explanation for the motherhood wage penalty is employer discrimination. In the large-scale survey studies that I've done, we do not have direct measures of discrimination. So it's often a residual explanation along with unmeasured differences in productivity. But Shelley Carell and colleagues have done a series of experimental and audit studies trying to capture the employer behaviors in response to parenthood for men and women, and do find evidence of employer discrimination against mothers in terms of job offers and wage offers. Okay. So with that background, why another paper on the motherhood wage penalty? Well, this time we want to look at what the impact of children is on Israeli women's employment and wages. And Israel offers an interesting country to study this, and there has not been an in-depth study in the way we're doing it in Israel to date, because Israel is a country with early marriage, very high fertility, and a strong family orientation for women, as well. So that's on the one hand. And on the other hand, Israel also evidences very high female educational attainment and employment. So somehow in Israel, we see both high women's participation in the labor market, as well as high engagement in family formation and family life. We also ask whether the impact of children on employment and wages in Israel varies among ethno-religious groups. So cross-national studies that of motherhood penalties that have included Israel as a case among other countries typically find a smaller wage penalty for motherhood in Israel, but they have not disaggregated this by ethno-religious groups. Minority groups other than the Jewish population vary in terms of their access to education, jobs, and the degree to which they're living in residentially segregated areas. So we think that the story on average for the country of a small motherhood penalty may not be that simple if we look at different groups of women within Israel. So the contributions of our study are that we're examining this motherhood penalty in a context of high fertility, low divorce, and high female education and employment. We're extending the body of literature on the motherhood penalty to a non-Western country, which have been relatively rarely studied, although this non-Western country has democratic and post-industrial features. We are conducting multi-group comparisons where we take an intersectional approach to investigating ethno-religious group differences in the motherhood penalty. And we further elaborate these group comparisons by examining differences by educational attainment levels. So let me talk a little bit about the setting. Some of you may be very familiar with the Israeli context, and some of you not so much. Before I began this collaboration, I was on the not so much side. So let me talk a little bit about the gender and work and family context in Israel. So in Israel, we see high fertility for all and high employment rates among Jews. When early on in Israel's existence, since there was a set of pronatalist policies instituted that were largely targeted at Ashkenazi Jews. And this is a Jewish group that is of European and American origin. So they were targeted to increase the fertility of Jewish people in Israel, and particularly this Jewish subgroup. Since 1954, there have been 14 fully paid weeks of maternity leave, plus 1 year of unpaid leave that's job protected. And this puts Israel pretty early on the timeline for having these types of leave policies. Since 1988, it has been illegal to treat workers differently based on their motherhood status. In the US, we have, I think, a law dating to the 70s or early 80s that makes it illegal to discriminate on the basis of pregnancy, but this law goes further to incorporate motherhood status as well. Since 2016, so quite recently, there is now free and compulsory schooling beginning at the age of 3. And there is also highly available and subsidized childcare for children aged 0 to 2. So there's pretty highly available childcare even for the littlest children, and now compulsory schooling starting at age 3. So if you want to return to the labor market as a new mother, there's a lot of supports for you to do that. In addition, there is restrictive or expensive contraception and abortion services, particularly this is true for Ashkenazi Jews. So perhaps as a result of these policies, there are very high fertility rates among groups in Israel. And these have been equalizing across groups. So early on, Muslims and other Israeli Palestinians had much higher fertility rates. Their rates have come down a bit, and the Jewish rate has remained robust. So now there's fairly equal fertility rates for all women, and actually Muslims and Jewish women have the highest rates. Also, there's early marriage, early motherhood, and low divorce rates. And for Jewish women, we have high employment and high education. Employment rates are pretty high and stable across the life cycle for Jewish women. There's very high educational attainment for Jewish women. Over half of Jewish women have a college degree or more. And while past studies find little to no penalty for motherhood in Israel, these have largely focused on Jewish women or been working with data sets where Jewish women predominate. and have not been analyzing the minority groups within Israel. So let me say a few words about, more than a few words, about ethno-religious groups and inequality in Israel. There are multiple ethno-national distinctions. At the national level, the biggest cleavage is between the Jewish majority and the Israeli Palestinians. The Jewish population's largest ethnic groups are the Ashkenazi, which are of European and American descent, and the Mizrahi, which are of Middle Eastern descent. Among the Arab population, or Israeli Palestinians, we find Muslims, Arab Christians, and the Druze as our largest subgroups. Social inequality is high across the Jewish-Israeli-Palestinian divide, with Arab Muslims, Druze, and Christians experiencing greater disadvantage. For example, the Equal Opportunity Employment Law is rarely applied to protect Israeli Palestinian workers, although they are covered by it. Israeli Palestinians attain less education. They tend to attend poorer quality schools. They occupy lower status jobs, receive lower wages, and experience higher unemployment relative to Jews. Moreover, employed Israeli Palestinian women are overrepresented in the public sector relative to Jewish women, and Jewish women are much more often employed in the private sector, and wages tend to be higher in the private sector. So I want to go a little deeper on each of the groups we're analyzing. So the biggest minority group in Israel are the Muslims. They constitute 21% of the Israeli population. And by far, they are the poorest and most disadvantaged group within Israel. They have high levels of segregation by locality, with limited employment opportunities in the communities where they live. They attend the lowest quality schools in Israel, and perhaps as a result of that, attain the fewest years of education, and this is particularly true for women. Muslims tend to hold low status jobs, have the highest levels of unemployment, and are economically the poorest group. And of all the groups in Israel of women, Muslim women have the lowest labor force participation rates. Slightly more advantaged than the Muslims are the Druze. So the Druze are an Arabic-speaking ethno-religious group that's very small. It's only 2% of the Israeli population. It emerged from Islam in the 11th century, but is now its own distinct ethno-religious group. The Druze are considered the most loyal of all the minority groups to the Israeli state, and they are the only Palestinian group whose men are allowed to serve in the Israeli military. And this military service opens up opportunities for employment for men in the armed forces, in public utilities, and in the police force. Druze women have moderate labor force participation. It's considerably higher than Muslim women's. But less so than Christian and Jewish women. While they're often employed, they have very low educational attainment and quite low earnings relative to the other groups. And Christians, along with Druze, have the lower fertility rates of these four groups in Israel. So our third group are the Christians. While Arab Christians represent multiple denominations in Israel, together they comprise one social group and constitute, again, about 2% of the Israeli population. And of all the minority groups, they are the most affluent. They are the most likely to live in urban areas, whereas Muslims and Druze are more often on the periphery of urban areas and out in rural areas. Christians are more likely to attend private church-run schools, which makes the schools they attend more of higher quality. Of all the minority groups, they attain the most education and have the highest labor force participation, and they achieve the highest occupational status. Although lower on all dimensions than Jewish women, they are higher than the rest of the minority groups. Like Jewish women, Christian women tend to marry later, and along with the Druze, have small family sizes, where small means an average of 2 kids. And there, for all groups, I should say, there's very low rates of childlessness. Okay, so lastly, a lot of this you can probably have detected by my descriptions of the other groups, but our final group here are the Jews. Jews hold the most socioeconomically privileged position in Israel and constitute 75% of the population. The Ashkenazi are the most privileged group. The Mizrahi, who are of Arab origin, are the largest ethnic group of Jews. They, along with smaller ethnic groups of Jews, are disadvantaged socially, politically, and economically relative to the Ashkenazi. In all of our analyses, we tested for Jewish ethnic group differences in motherhood effects on employment and on wages and found none. So for simplicity, with all the comparisons we have going on, we've pooled all of the subgroups of Jewish ethnicities together into one group in our analyses. So as a group, Jewish women attain the most schooling, and as I said, roughly half hold a post-secondary degree, which compares to less than a third of Muslim and Druze women. Jewish women have the highest labor force participation rate. The majority work for private employers. They earn the most, held the best jobs, and as we'll see, return fastest to work following a childbirth. While Jewish women marry a bit later, in part because they're completing post-secondary education, their birth rates are about equivalent to Muslims. So they tend to have large families, nevertheless, in a more compressed time frame because of their later marriage age. So based on this context and the differences between groups, what do we expect to see as we start on these analyses of employment and wages? First, we expect that educational attainment will predict faster returns to employment following a birth and should be inversely related to the size of the motherhood penalty for all groups. So even though groups differ in educational attainment, we think that high attainment will still lower the motherhood penalty and encourage women to return to work, regardless of ethnic group. But we also think we'll see differences among ethno-religious groups in terms of motherhood's effect on employment and wages. Jewish women's higher education, their higher use of maternity and job protected leave, and their higher take-up of publicly funded childcare altogether predict a faster return to work and a smaller motherhood penalty relative to the minority groups in our study. Second, we think that Christian women who look the most like Jewish women of all the minority groups with higher education and high labor force participation, we predict for them also a faster return to employment following a birth and a lower motherhood penalty. However, these pros, reducing the time out of work and the motherhood penalty may be offset by the fact that Christian women tend to be more residentially segregated than Jews, have more limited employment opportunities, and within the family have more traditional gender divisions of labor, meaning paid and unpaid labor or care work and market work. The Druze women who have lower educational attainment and lower labor force attachment, we predict a slower return and a higher motherhood penalty. And for Muslim women with the lowest education and employment opportunities, high residential segregation, peripheral location, low opportunities in their communities, and a very traditional gender division of labor between market and non-market work, we predict the slowest return to work. And we maybe anticipate that motherhood penalties could be steep, but because the Muslim women rarely have higher education and their labor force participation is so low, those women who do remain employed after childbirth may be selected in ways we can't capture in our model, which may mitigate against finding a motherhood wage penalty. This is a similar case to what we see in Italy, where labor force participation is low, but there's little motherhood penalty because the bar for women's employment is so high that they tend to, if their mother is unemployed, they tend to be pretty successful in the labor market. Okay, so the data we're using come from a lot of sources. The data span 1996 to 2017. And it's a panel set that's based on administrative records. We took a 20% sample of Israeli-born women based on the 1995 census, and we limited the sample to those who were younger than 21 in 1995 because we wanted to be able to capture change in their motherhood status and marital status and educational attainment over time. The yearly data are based on records from the Israeli Tax Authority, the Ministry of the Interior, and the Council for Higher Education. It's a pretty massive data set that took a couple years to assemble, but in the end, we have really high quality data for 94,000 women. And in our person years analysis, where we do our fixed effects, we have over 1.3 million person year observations. And this large sample really enables us to model the smaller minority groups that are only 2% of the population in our analyses. So this is just a recap of the ethno-religious composition and labor force participation of the groups we're analyzing. So that first column is what I just walked through with what proportion of the population do these groups represent. The second column shows you what is the female labor force participation rates for the 4 different groups. So you see that Israeli Jewish women's labor force participation rate is quite high at 86%. That's higher than a number of OECD countries as well. But the labor force participation rates for minority groups are much lower, with Christians being the highest and Muslims the lowest, with only 25% of Muslim women in the labor force. Because of the baseline composition in these labor force participation rates, our resulting sample, particularly for the wage analyses, is in the final column. So we have a slight overrepresentation of Jewish women and a slight underrepresentation of Muslim women in our wage analysis, in part because of the differential labor force participation rates, although Christian and Druze women are represented at the rate they are in the population. Okay, so I'm going to be showing you 2 sets of analyses. The first analysis is event history analysis, predicting re-entry to employment following a first and second birth. I'm going to be showing you Kaplan-Meier survival curves by ethnic religious group and education, and then we'll look at Cox proportional hazard models, also by parity and ethnicity, to look at the factors that increase and decrease the time to re-entry following a birth. The second set of analyses we'll be looking at are the earnings analyses. So we're going to be using fixed effects here to predict earnings. We run separate models by ethnicity, and we include interactions between number of children and education to look at how the wage penalty differs both across the ethnic groups and then by level of education within the ethnic groups. And all differences by ethnic groups and education are tested through pooled models, which I will not be showing. So the dependent variable in our employment analysis is the duration of labor market absence following a birth in months until either event, meaning re-entry to the labor market, or censor, meaning they don't re-enter the labor market before the observation period ends. Our earning analyses is the natural log of monthly earnings, which we adjust for inflation to reflect 1995 values. And taking the log helps normalize the earnings distribution and mitigates the effects of outliers in the distribution on our estimation of our coefficients. Our primary independent variables are these. So in the employment analysis, we're looking at return to paid employment or not. And in the earnings analysis, we take the variable out of the employment analysis, which is duration of labor market absence after a birth. And that's one of our predictor variables. And we also, in the earnings analysis, include probability of employment as a selection term based on other regression models where we predict the likelihood of employment. And in addition, we're using fixed effects. So we're trying to reduce the unobserved heterogeneity that could produce differences in the motherhood wage penalty across groups and education levels. For all analyses, we use number of children who are younger than age 18. We tried this in a variety of ways, and looking at a linear effect of children, and although the effect is monotonic, it's not linear. So I'm going to be presenting dummies for one child and 2 and more, and in some analyses 1, 2, or 3 and more, for simplicity's sake. Our ethnic groups are the 4 that I've described, and the education levels we're going to be using are measured as high school completion or less. The middle education is called matriculation, and that is an exam that you take after you finish high school that you must take to enter university, and even if you don't, it is a credential in and of itself. And our third educational category is a post-secondary degree. Control variables for all analyses include age and age squared and marital status. Labor market characteristics include months of experience. Imputed hours, we don't have direct measures of work hours, but we've imputed these from the average weekly hours for women in the detailed industrial groups that we have, and public sector status. We also include a couple of measures to tap local labor market conditions. We use the score on socioeconomic index of the community, where higher scores indicate a stronger economy. And we use an index called the peripherality index, which measures how distant you are, how far your residence is from an urban center, with higher values meaning you're closer to the urban center. Okay, so here is some descriptive statistics. First, we see that marriage rates are very high for women 21 and over in Israel. They're higher for Christians at 86%, down to a low of about 78% for Jewish women. This in part is capturing, though, their later age of marriage, so there's more person years early on for Jews where they're not married. Childlessness is fairly rare, and family sizes tend to be big. So over 60% of Muslim women and over half of Jewish women have at least 3 children in their families. The annual income here is given in shekels. It's highest, as we may expect, for Jewish women and lowest for Druze and Muslim women. And if you're thinking, how much is a shekel worth? It's about 3 shekels to $1. So if you divide those annual incomes by 3, you'd have a sense of where approximately the American dollar values would be. In terms of educational attainment, we see while over half of Muslim women have a high school degree or less, it's flipped for Jewish women, where over half have a college degree or more. Educational attainment is somewhat higher for Christian women, where 42% have a post-secondary degree, and again is low for Druze women, where about half finish with high school and no more. Month of maternity leaves here. This is the median month of maternity leave following a birth, or being labor market absence following a birth. So for Jewish women, on average, the median is 11 months. So they return to work, the average person does within a year of having a birth. And it goes to a really long period of time for Muslim women, whose median length of time out of the workforce after birth is 5.5 years. For Christians, it's 3 years, and for Druze, it's 2 years. And associatedly, that tracks on to months of experience as well. We see public sector employment is slightly higher for minority groups relative to Jews. SES is stronger in the higher values in the communities where Jewish women live, and they also are closer to urban centers relative to minority groups. Okay, so predicting labor market reentry. These graphs show survival curves for return to work following births. The first birth is the first panel, and second birth is the second panel. The survival rate is the vertical axis, and the time out of work following a birth, whether on leave or just out, is on the horizontal axis. So you can see here, Jews are the solid light line. They return the fastest, quite quickly to work following a first birth, and a little bit longer, but still quite quickly following a second birth. At the opposite end are Muslims, who are the dotted line, who have the slowest return to employment following a birth, and particularly after a second birth, many never return. And Christians and Druze are quite similar and fall in the middle. Here we're looking at the same survival curves with a different panel for each ethno-religious group, and this is the first birth only. But here the lines are tracking on educational attainment. So the darkest line is a college degree. The middle weight line is having that matriculation exam, and the light is having high school or less. So one thing to see is all Jewish women return to work pretty quickly, and it doesn't matter how much education they have. There's really no difference by educational attainment in return to work for Jewish women. At the other end, Muslim women and Druze are there's a strong educational gradient where women with college degrees, while rare, return to work more quickly following a birth, and women with less education return much more slowly. We also see that educational gradient among Christians, but it is less pronounced than among the Druze and Muslims. This is the same set of graphs for the second birth. Again, no gradient for Jews, large gradient for Muslim women. And the educational gradient is disappearing here for Christian women, although among Druze, the post-secondary women with post-secondary degrees do return faster. Okay, so this table shows the percent change in the predicted hazard of returning to work after a birth. And here we're showing this for first birth is the first panel, and second birth is the second panel. We're showing the effects of marital status and education, public sector, and the locality measures. All models also control for all the other variables I listed in the control section. For brevity, I'm only putting 1 star by significant coefficients, although most are significant at 0.001. And bolded coefficients here are coefficients that are significantly different from Jewish women. So if we look at this, we see that marriage encourages a return to work after first birth for Jewish women, but not other women. Muslims, if you're divorced, it does, but not marriage. In contrast, for Muslim women, it tends to discourage return to work, although that effect is not significant. Being divorced increases the likelihood of return to work, and particularly for Muslim women after their second birth. Education matters quite a lot, and consistent with what we saw in the survival curves we just looked at, education matters most strongly for predicting return to work for Muslim women and for Druze women. And in particular, post-secondary degrees have much larger effects than matriculation. And these persist, although they are somewhat attenuated in predicting return to work after a second birth. Public sector matters for return to work and more strongly for minority women. And the rest of the variables behave as we would expect as well. So what's the summary of what we found for our employment analyses? Childbirth deters employment more for minority groups, and particularly Muslims. Jewish women return the fastest and have the least lost experience, and Muslims the slowest after a birth. And this may be related to differential access to leave and childcare in the communities in which they reside, as well as differences in the normal gender division of labor within their households, which tends to be more egalitarian among the Jewish population, although we don't have measures of that in the model. We see a strong educational gradient for minority women, but not Jewish women. But we have to remember that even though higher education drives Muslim and Druze women back into the workforce at a disproportionate level relative to Christian and Jewish women, these kinds of degrees are quite relatively more rare among the Muslims and Druze. Okay, so now I'm going to turn to our wage analyses. I'm trying to watch the time here. So these analyses come from fixed effects models. And this first panel presents what is the motherhood penalty as a percent of wages lost for 1, 2, and 3 or more children by ethno-religious group. And these are fully specified models with all the controls in them. They're listed at the bottom of this chart. And we're looking first at a baseline model that only controls for age, marital status, and probability of employment, and then a full model which introduces all of our human capital, job characteristics, and community characteristics variables. So in the baseline model, we only observe motherhood penalties for Jews and for Christians, and they are larger the larger the family size, but we are not seeing motherhood penalties for Muslims or Druze. Moreover, when we control for all the factors listed, we explain the Jewish motherhood penalty in full, and we only have a persisting wage penalty for motherhood for 1 and 2 children among Christians. Now, some of these are showing positive effects of children, which may indicate a wage bonus. We don't know what to make about this, except that with the lower employment rates, particularly for Muslims and Druze after having children, it could be that the women who are in the labor market must be. So that women with more children who are in the labor market among Muslims are pursuing wages to support their family. But we don't really know what lies underneath the positive effects of children that we're seeing here for all groups. When we disaggregate this further by educational attainment, we get these results. So here we're seeing the same set of panels as I showed in the earlier graph, but the first 2 rows here are for the least educated women who have a second high school or less. The next set here of rows are for women with a matriculation. And then the final set of rows are for women with college degrees or more. And what we see clearly here is that there is a strong motherhood penalty for all women in the lowest educational group. And it is largest for Christian women among those. But once we introduce all of our control variables, these penalties are much attenuated among the least educated group, although they are still quite sizable for Christian women and persist for all groups except for the Druze with 2 or more children here, who do not have a penalty and seem to have a wage bonus for 2 or more children. As we increase in educational attainment, the penalties start vanishing as well. So the more highly educated you are, the smaller the wage penalty is. So at medium levels of education, we still see persistent penalties for Jews and Christians in the baseline models. And we fully explain those penalties, though, with the introduction of human capital and community and job characteristics for Jewish women, although we see penalties persisting for Christian women. And again, we are not observing any penalties for Muslim and Druze women, but they are rare because they are less likely to have this level of education and less likely to be in the workforce after having 1 or 2 children. Finally, at the highest level of educational attainment, we see small motherhood penalties for the first child for Jews and Christian women in the baseline model, but we do not observe any penalties for the highly educated in any minority group or Jewish group once we introduce the full set of controls. And indeed, we are seeing wage bonuses. This is a sensitivity analysis where we introduced the variables in that full model 1 at a time to see if some of the variables were more explaining the baseline penalties that we observed. And what's highlighted in green here, so each of these, we're starting with a baseline model, and we have this set of models for the least educated, medium education, and high education. And in each, we start with a baseline model, and then 1 by 1, we swap out the variables that we add in the full model. And what's highlighted in green here are the variables that do the most to reduce the motherhood wage penalty. So what we see pretty consistently is that experience in every model for Jewish and Christian women, but for all women who are the least educated, months of experience explain the most of the motherhood wage penalty, which is pretty consistent with what we know from other studies. In addition, the length of leave matters for Jewish women in every model, and often for Christian women as well. And in this baseline model, for the least educated workers, for the Druze as well. So the longer your leave following a childbirth, the bigger your penalty is. And once we control for it, it explains more of the motherhood penalty. Finally, locality SES matters for Muslims and Christians among the least educated, and for Jews and Christians at medium and high education as well. So we unpack this effect a bit more for length of leave, and these graphs show predicted monthly earnings by ethnicity, education, and months of leave. So we have a separate graph here for each of the 4 ethnic religious groups. The darkest line are women with post-secondary degrees, medium line matriculation, and the lightest are the least educated. And what we see here on the horizontal axis is that the longer you're out of the workforce following a birth, what is that relationship to what your earnings are after you reenter? And one thing is that for Muslim and Druze, we don't see any effect for being out of the workforce on how much they earn when they come back. So leave, being lost experience doesn't matter, or the length of maternity leave and parental leave does not matter for Muslims and Druze. For Jews, it matters somewhat, and also for Christians. We see a slight downward sloping line, which indicates that the longer you are out, particularly for post-secondary degree holders, the steeper, the lower your wages are when you re-enter. So, summary of the impact of motherhood on wages. Past findings of small penalties for Israeli women are largely driven by highly educated Jewish women, who are the largest group in the labor force. The least educated women receive the largest child penalties, and Christians tend to have the highest child penalty. Experience and leave length partially explain Jewish and Druze penalties. Experience, locality, SES partially explain Muslim and Christian penalties. Among medium education, women have smaller penalties overall, and we only observe them among Jews and Christians, and these are largely explained by experience, leave length, and SES. And finally, highly educated women have very small to no penalties at all for motherhood, and we're even seeing bonuses. We only observe penalties for Jews and Christians in the baseline model, and we fully explain these with length of leave. One note is the very small n's and the high positive selection among medium to highly educated Muslim and Druze make us not too confident in the bonuses we're observing, but we are pretty confident that they aren't receiving a penalty for motherhood. Okay, I'm almost done. Last slide. Implications. In a context of high employment and high fertility, it is possible to speed return to work and eliminate the motherhood penalty. And what does it? Supportive factors are high educational attainment, short paid job protective leave of under a year. And I know that seems long in the US, but that's actually about what we see as effective for the motherhood penalty across European countries. Access to publicly funded and early childhood education and childcare we think matter, although we don't have measures of that here. And access to local job opportunities. So, however, more vulnerable workers, those who are less educated and those who are ethnic minorities, incur high employment deterrents for motherhood and often wage costs of childbearing, particularly Christian women. Higher costs of motherhood for less educated women is similar to what we see in the US. But one thing that's different is that in the US, we see steeper penalties for white women and lower motherhood penalties for Black women. And that's different than what we're seeing here with Christians in Israel. This is possibly due to differences in marriage rates, family structure, and family economic health. Because Black American women tend to support children on their own and thus continue working through childbearing, whereas Christian women in Israel may be able to rely on their more affluent spouses' earnings, and thus that slows their reentrance to work and increases their motherhood penalty. Raising educational attainment among Muslims and Druze may ameliorate the negative effects of motherhood on employment and pay, although we're not seeing much for the higher educated groups here in terms of effects of motherhood on pay. Increasing economic opportunities and reducing residential segregation, although this is politically really difficult in Israel, may also lower penalties for Druze and Christian women. And that is my talk. We are very much in the middle of all these analyses, so I greatly look forward to your feedback and comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michelle, for this really, really interesting talk. I have so many questions, but as a moderator, I need to provide room for others to ask questions. So I'll start. So there is one question by that is posted anonymously, so I'll read it out loud. And it says, very interesting work. Do you have more information about the kinds of jobs to which women are returning? Are women more likely to return to part-time jobs? What are the proportion of women working in the informal sector?
Great questions. Jewish women, because of their high education, are not likely to be working in the informal sector, and they tend to return to professional or managerial work. That's not true for Muslim women, who are more often in the informal sector and tend to work very low status jobs as a group. Druze also, I mean, a lot of employment in the public sector for minority women is pretty high. So that helps them have greater job security and wages. But as groups, the minority groups, the Druze and the Muslims, tend to be more in the informal and more in menial jobs. The Christian women tend to get better jobs, although they also tend to be in the public sector as well. Part-time status, the average working hours for women in Israel are about 35 hours a week when they're working. There's not a lot of part-time, I believe, among Jews, but I'm not confident in the answer on that question.
Thank you. And may I just like a very quick follow-up on that question? Is there any information reporting that the reporting on employment status in service would change depending on the informality of the work? Like I know in certain contexts in Spain, the data shows that it wouldn't change how someone would report. They report that they will be working even if in the informal sector. And I guess if there is any evidence of a different pattern in the Israel context.
Great question. So this is not just self-report of working status. We also determine this from the tax authority records. So I would imagine that Muslim women, if they are returning to informal work, especially in a family business and aren't reporting earnings, would not be counted as employed here.
Very interesting. Okay, I also forgot to mention everybody, just as a reminder that everybody can submit questions to the Q&A button. You can see it up there and you can type your questions. So now I'll continue calling on people. We have a question from Jerry, actually a couple of questions. So Jerry, I'll welcome you to unmute yourself if you are able to do so now, or maybe I need to, yeah, I think you're allowed to talk now. So the floor is yours.
Thank you, Pilar. Thank you, Michelle. Very interesting work and very rich because of the data that you've tied into. And I guess I also want to say welcome back. It's good to see you. My basic question is, about treating all Jewish women as homogeneous in regard to their religious beliefs. I have the understanding that 10 to 12 or so percentage of Israel's population is ultra-Orthodox, that fertility rates are maybe twice as high there as in the rest of the population, that, as Wendy pointed out in the Q&A, labor force participation rates are very low. I don't know if the data permit it, but it would seem to me that's a big group and probably very different than other groups, including the rest of the Jewish population. Is there a way of dealing with that? Can you separate them out?
So we initially did separate out several ethnic groups of Jews in our preliminary analyses, but we didn't find any differences in between those groups.
But you did, if I understand correctly, you did not separate the ultra-Orthodox from other Jews. You separated on the basis of Ashkenazi and whatever, which is not the same.
Right, yeah. I'm pretty sure, I know when we first started this, we had about 12 groups we were comparing. So I would need to look back at those analyses, but we did disaggregate the Jewish population to look at these starting out, but we didn't find any compelling differences. So we decided to pull them together. But that's a really good point. And you're right that the ultra-Orthodox are having much higher fertility rates and lower labor force participation rates. And it could be that part of the reason we didn't see differences is that you were predicting reentry after a birth. So we're looking at women who were employed and left and then are coming back, as well as women who are in the labor market already in order to observe a motherhood wage penalty. And if the ultra-Orthodox women are rarely in the labor market, we may not have enough observations on them. But that's a great point, and I'm going to take note of that and check with my collaborators. Thank you.
Thank you. I will welcome Wendy, who also has a question. And if we can have Wendy allowed to unmute herself.
Hi, I think I've unmuted now, right?
Yes, we can hear you. Thank you.
Okay, good. Hi, Michelle. Thank you so much. This was a really, really interesting talk. I was struck by your introduction, where you talked about the pronatalist policies. And I mean, first of all, that's a really impressive list of pronatalist policies, but you mentioned that they were mostly targeted at Ashkenazi Jews, which is something that I expected at the beginning would make a big difference, especially since you mentioned that your other research finds that the motherhood wage penalty is responsive to policy interventions. Could you say a little bit more about which of those policies could apply to non-Jewish groups? Would they be eligible for? And are they available to people who are not citizens if citizen is on the basis of Jewish ethnicity?
Great questions. So they are available to all Israeli women. I don't know about the citizenship question. That's a good one. In their origin, they were intended to increase the fertility of a particular group. Kind of similar to France, where the pronatalist policies there were meant to increase the fertility rates of French women. But now those policies are available to all. So it's more, all women are entitled to leave. They are entitled to subsidized childcare, but my understanding is that subsidized childcare centers are not as available in the communities where minority women live. So even though the policy appears neutral in its implementation, it is not equally accessible.
Mm-hmm.
So your other question is, that the motherhood wage penalty is responsive to policy, wouldn't you expect that would play a larger role? I mean, I think that's a great question, and I think that it does play a role. So I think the fact that we consistently find smaller motherhood penalties in Israel generally, and that we can fully explain the ones we do see by and large for most groups in Israel when we introduce controls, is a result of these long-standing policies that facilitate women doing both employment and caring for kids.
Yeah.
But I think because of the nature of the policies are so long-standing, with the exception of the 2016 policy that extends mandatory and free education down to 3-year-olds, I think that we should be, as we get data going further out, I am interested to see if there's a policy impact of that change on women's employment and the motherhood penalty in the future.
Great, thank you.
Thank you very much, everybody. So we are unfortunately at time. So thank you again for taking part in the Penn Population Studies Colloquium series. And if you have any questions that have not been answered during this talk, attendees are encouraged to contact the speaker directly. Thank you again, and have a good rest of your days.
Thanks for having me.